Welcome to study session 15, Failure of African Resistance to European Invasion. Introduction. In this session, you will learn about the factors responsible for failure of Africans' resistance to European invasion. In the preceding sessions, we have seen that Africans did not easily surrender their territories to the British. We also stressed that African rulers who initially signed treaties with Europeans later abrogated the treaties immediately they realized the adverse implications of the document on the sovereignty of their states and kingdoms. We have discussed various examples of how Africans resisted European invasions with strong determination. The Libyans, Tanzanians, Ethiopians, and Africans in West Africa stoutly defended the sovereignty of their territories against European invasion. However, despite their determined efforts, they, except the Ethiopians, failed to drive away the European invaders. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the various factors responsible for the failure of African resistance to European invasion. Factors responsible for the failure of African resistance. 1. Many factors were responsible for the failure of African resistance to European invasion. Firstly, Africans were not united against European invaders. Except in Libya and Ethiopia, Africans did not fight the European invaders as a united people. Secondly, African leaders did not consider their relations with Europeans in racial terms. There was no Commonwealth ideology that would have embarked Africans to appeal to racial consciousness in organizing their defense against European invaders. Thirdly, dynastic disputes, which were very common in many African states and kingdoms, weakened African resistance to their European invaders. Rival princes usually allied with Europeans against each other. Fourthly, in addition to dynastic disputes, religious differences created divisions among Africans. Factors responsible for the failure of African resistance. 2. Fifthly, the wounds created by the imperial expansion of some states in Africa had not been completely healed before Europeans invaded the continent. Before and in the 19th century, many powerful states or kingdoms in Africa had expanded its territories at the expense of weaker ones. The weaker ones, which had been made subordinate or vassals by their stronger neighbors, still nursed desires to regain their independence. Sixthly, many African states and kingdoms had either declined or were on the verge of decline when the Europeans struck. For instance, the old Oyo Empire had declined and fallen. Its successor states were engaged in political and economic rivalries. Some states or kingdoms that had not declined were rendered politically weak as a result of their constant wars with their neighbors. Factors responsible for the failure of African resistance. 3. Apart from the above, it should also be noted that some expanding African states were yet to consolidate themselves before the Europeans invaded them. The 7th factor was the superior army and weapons of the European invaders. The Industrial Revolution made Europeans to be technologically superior to Africans. Old weapons hitherto used in Europe were replaced with new ones. Indeed, by 1889, the Maxim gun had been invented. The new weapons, including rockets and cannons, were used by European invaders. Apart from the disparity between the invaders and Africans in weapons, there were also a lot of difference in the nature and discipline of their armies. European armies were well trained and disciplined. Most African states and kingdoms did not have regular armies. Their soldiers were made of irregulars, hunters, farmers, and volunteers who fought only whenever their territories were attacked by enemies. In other words, most African armies were ad hoc armies. It can be seen from the foregoing that the political situations in Africa, the technological and military superiority of the European invaders accounted for the failure of African resistance. So confident of victory were the European invaders that a European poet was said to have written thus: "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." Summary: in this study session, you have learned that 1. Africans did not combine efforts to fight their invaders. 2. Interstate or interkingdom rivalries militated against African unity. 3. Dynastic disputes which were common in Africa weakened African resistance. 4. Instead of uniting against the common enemy, some Africans allied with the enemy against fellow Africans. Africans at this period were not racially conscious. 5. In weapons, technology, military discipline, and organization, the European invaders were superior to Africans. End of study session 15. Thanks for listening.